I see a lot of people on the left arguing for an intersectional approach to politics. And one of the arguments that I've seen thrown around quite often for this approach to politics is that when you have different minority groups who all have their own interests, but still have these broader interests that connect these different minority groups, it is more ideal to have them separate from one another to advocate for those interests so they can have leadership amongst their own kind. Um, and when there are things that all of said groups can agree on, they can form a sort of rainbow coalition that puts them all under one banner and argues for those for liberation on those common grounds. I think this is a fine approach. I have some structural criticisms to it, but I think it's fine. You know, the Black Panthers were doing their own thing and they were doing good work, and only black people were allowed, but they did things together with the White Panthers, who operated as a sort of offshoot of the Black Panthers, but were comprised of only white people. And when they had commonalities, they operated together on those commonalities. Okay, fine. But I have heard feminists online say that there are things that men's rights activists are right about. When, for example, they bring up the suicide rates among men, the fact that men take on much more demanding, far more dangerous jobs than women, when they bring up the fact that there is preferential treatment toward women in divorce courts, and that this is based on gender stereotypes, the first thing leftists, and even these intersectional leftists that I just described, will bring up is, oh, no, no, no. Men's issues, that's actually a feminist issue. And actually, second wave feminists talked about this in the 1970s. That's the argument that they'll make. That's what they'll say. And then suddenly, it isn't. We should all operate our own organizations with, you know, each of us common individuals who share those interests. We shouldn't operate them by ourselves. Suddenly, we need this big tent for women's issues, which also happen to be men's issues. I think that's hypocritical. I think that's hypocritical not just because it contradicts this broader approach, but also because it's convoluted and difficult to understand for people in a way that I think is antithetical to the broader goal of leftism, which is a populist upheaval intended to fundamentally change the systems that weaken us, that are controlling so many aspects of our lives and happen to have these detrimental effects on these various minority groups, but also has an effect that is detrimental on the majority group, which is humanity. About half of humanity is comprised of men. And to me, it stands to reason that maybe not all issues raised by men's rights activists are valid, but a hell of a lot of them are, and feminists will tell you just the same. But what they will refuse to say is that those men's rights activists ought to have their own organization that is run by men, that is meant for men, and that advocates on the behalf of men. That is a non-starter for them. They want it to be a feminist organization. They want to claim that the plight of men is entirely fixable by feminist solutions, that is explainable by feminist critiques. That may be the case. I'm not even necessarily arguing against the notion that that is the case. But does that not stand in contradiction to this perspective that is argued for by so many on the left for tactical unity on these broad issues that affect all of us, but a more decentralized approach when it comes to the plight of indigenous people, trans people, black people, and so on? Women, that's another example. They're fine with going specific and exclusive when it comes to those groups. But when it comes to men, all of a sudden, that's something that goes a bridge too far. All of a sudden, that's misogynistic. I think this is hypocritical. And I also think that this stands in the way of that broader goal, which is, again, total liberation, a populist upheaval of the system. And I think it's alienating a lot of young men who would otherwise feel heard by a message that directly addresses the problems that are facing young men in this nation today and all over the world, that acknowledges their plight. That message isn't getting to them because they need to deliver this convoluted feminist critique that necessarily relies upon the notion that men's issues happen to be women's issues, that they must be described in these terms, and that you must organize in an intergender group in order to advance freedom and progress. I don't even disagree with the idea of these big multiracial, multigender groups. I think that in general, there's a tactical and optical advantage to organizing around those lines. But I can't deny the benefits to this more decentralized approach. And a lot of the people who make these points argue for that in every other context. So my point is that it is hypocritical to say that the MRAs are right, but also wrong.